Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
One of the leaders of the campaign to leave the EU is facing a criminal investigation into where its funding came from. Arron Banks is being investigated by the National Crime Agency after the Electoral Commission said it suspected he was not the true source of £8 million loaned to the campaign. Mr Banks says that he is pleased to have the chance to put an end to what he says are ludicrous allegations. Meanwhile, Remain supporters have called for Brexit to be halted while the claims are investigated. Well, following this story for us today, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's in Westminster. John, tell us a little bit more about what the Electoral Commission have had to say and whether there is actually any likelihood of what Remainers want to happen here, Brexit being stopped.
Well, that's a long way off yet, the second part of that question. But the first part is what's going to happen is that the National Crime Agency is going to be asked to investigate if there has been any criminal wrongdoing here. Now, there's long been a row over suggestions that perhaps Russian money might have been going into the Leave campaign. And Arron Banks has been involved in some rows over this over the past few months, particularly with the committee, the Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport. Now, what has happened today is that the Electoral Commission have said that they've got reasonable grounds to say some money came from what they call impermissible sources and that Mr Banks knowingly concealed the true circumstances. Well, Mr Banks, a colourful extrovert character, who has tweeted to say that he's on a fishing trip in Bermuda at the moment. He still found time to put out a pretty defiant statement denying the allegations of wrongdoing. Mr Banks has said this: "I'm confident that a full and frank investigation will finally put an end to the ludicrous allegations levelled against me and my colleagues. There's no evidence," he says, "of any wrongdoing from the companies I own." He says, "I am a UK taxpayer and I've never received any foreign donations. The Electoral Commission has produced no evidence to the contrary. The Electoral Commission has referred me to the National Crime Agency under intense political pressure from anti-Brexit supporters." Well, this really came to light in a series of pretty fractious exchanges between Mr Banks and the DCMS Select Committee. They published a report in July actually calling for the National Crime Agency to be brought in, and they also talked about in their report about Mr Banks having meetings with the Russian ambassador and Russian embassy staff. When they tried to quiz him on this at a hearing in June, it all ended in this rather bad-tempered way.
Well, I appreciate the time, but it'd be great if you could just give us 5 minutes and Mr. Vickers can finish this question. You sure?
No, the word is no. When you went out, you said 20 minutes, and I think we've run past 20 minutes, and I'm sorry, but there it is.
Okay, well, Mr. Vickers said he doesn't wish to pursue his question, so we'll leave it there.
And thank you very much for listening patiently to the answer.
And then if you want to leave, I would love to give the committee clerks the documents that
So a colourful walkout by Mr Banks there. In the report that followed that, the committee said that he walked out to avoid scrutiny of the content of the discussions with the Russian embassy. Now, as you might expect, because he suggested it in the first place, Damien Collins, who you saw there, the chairman of that committee, he had this welcome for what's been announced today.
I'm not surprised. It would appear that the Electoral Commission shared the concerns that the Select Committee had, which was it wasn't clear to us from the evidence we received from Arron Banks and his associates what the real source of the funds were for his large donations to the referendum campaign. So we said if there were any ambiguity at all, it should be referred to the National Crime Agency, who do have the powers to conduct a rigorous investigation. So I'm pleased that the Electoral Commission have decided to refer, and I hope this investigation by the NCA resolves the matter once and for all.
The next thing that's going to happen is that Mr Collins' committee is going to take evidence from the Electoral Commission that's made the decision to bring in the crime busters, if we can call them that, today. That's next Tuesday. They're also going to take evidence from the Information Commissioner. That's Elizabeth Denham. She's due to publish a report the same day on data in politics. Remember, this all stems from an investigation into what the committee called disinformation and fake news. Well, it has now blown up into a much bigger row over the funding of the Leave campaign. And of course, many Remain supporters are crying foul and will no doubt, depending on how this investigation goes, no doubt some of them will call for a rerun of the referendum. That looks unlikely.
OK, John, thanks for now.
An investigation is being launched by the National Crime Agency into the prominent businessman Arron Banks and his Leave.eu campaign for alleged offences committed in the EU referendum. Mr Banks was referred to the NCA by the elections watchdog, which suspects that £8 million given to the campaign had come from what it called impermissible sources. Arron Banks has welcomed the investigation and said he never received any foreign funding during the campaign. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg reports.
One of Brexit's bad boys, as he describes himself. Arron Banks doesn't look like he has much on his mind today. But the multimillionaire bankroller of some of the campaign to leave the EU is now under investigation over whether he committed crimes.
We've had many investigations and many questions about where that money came from, the largest donation in British political history.
The commission in charge of the referendum rules suspects Mr Banks was not the true source of £8 million worth of loans to groups that supported Brexit. And they suspect that the loans came from a company in the Isle of Man. That's not allowed by law. And they suspect Mr Banks and his colleagues knowingly concealed that. The Commission says at least £2.9 million of that money was spent during the referendum campaign.
Just this way, chaps.
Mr Banks and his colleagues have never been backwards about coming forwards. In June, they came to Westminster and were pushed by MPs over links to foreign money.
We've now got a full-scale Russian witch hunt going on.
Did you do business in Russia as a consequence of these meetings you had?
I've got no business interests in Russia, and I have done no business deals in Russia. All Remainers? Hands up? Yeah, I think so. You've got a vested interest in trying to discredit the Brexit campaign.
MPs for a lunch and in disbelief when the session ran over. His associate, who's also being investigated, denies doing anything wrong.
Yes, I confirm it wouldn't have come from Russia. I run the group of companies where the money was from, and we don't have any transactions that are from Russia.
Mr Banks welcomed the inquiry, saying, "I am confident that a full and frank investigation will put an end to the ludicrous allegations. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing from the companies I own. I have never received any foreign donations."
You may never have heard of him, but Arron Banks is not afraid of controversy. He has a big chequebook and a big ambition to make Brexit happen.
He was always happy to push political convention.
Selfie? Do a selfie, come on. Do a selfie, hang on, come on.
But in doing so, might Arron Banks also have broken the law? Laura Kuensberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, I'm joined now by our reporter Manveen Rana. And Manveen, you've been investigating the story for the past year. You interviewed Arron Banks in the summer. You asked him about the source of his funding. What did he say?
Well, when I spoke to Arron Banks, he was absolutely adamant that this was all money that had come from his own personal wealth. You know, we'd managed to see the publicly listed accounts for his British companies. We couldn't see any that seemed to have sufficient funds for a donation of this size. And yet every time I asked, he kept saying this money had come directly from his bank account. Now, the report today shows that the Electoral Commission was clearly asking similar questions. They've been able to see much more detailed accounts for Rock Services, which is the company that he said that the donation had come through. And they don't believe there was enough money in that company to be able to justify such a large donation. They've pointed to another company, an offshore entity, Rock Holdings, as being part of the financial transactions. Now, Rock Holdings is registered in the Isle of Man, which under electoral law wouldn't be admissible as a donor. It also presents challenges for the Electoral Commission because they can't follow the money trail so far, and that's one of the reasons they've now referred this to the National Crime Agency, and it's become a live criminal investigation. Arron Banks and Elizabeth Bilney have again today denied any wrongdoing.
Thank you very much, Manveen Rana.
£8 million from potentially impermissible sources. The Electoral Commission already said it suspected Arron Banks was not the true source of all the huge donations and loans to a pro-Brexit group. Well, today that watchdog dramatically upped the ante by handing the case over to the National Crime Agency. It said it would investigate whether the funding by Mr. Banks, along with a number of individuals and organisations linked to him, broke electoral law during the 2016 referendum. Mr. Banks welcomed the inquiry. So just where did that cash come from? Here's our political correspondent, Michael Crick.
Arron Banks gave or lent more than £8 million to various Brexit organisations during the referendum.
What would you like to say to us?
Indeed, he's thought to be the biggest single donor to any campaign in British history. But now the Electoral Commission has referred him and his funding to the National Crime Agency, the highest police body in the land. The Commission say they've reasonable grounds to suspect that Mr. Banks and his firms were not the true source of the £8 million, that he and others concealed the true details of these financial transactions, and that various criminal offences may have been committed. Arron Banks shot to fame 4 years ago when he announced from the lawn of his lavish country home that he was giving £1 million to UKIP.
Well, someone has to fund us. You know, we have to have money. We haven't got...
It was the size of that gift and his cheeky manner which prompted questions then and ever since as to how rich Banks really is and how he made his money.
Point as well. I'm a self-made person. I made my money from a desk and 2 telephones, so I resent your kind of comment that I'm some sort of rich Tory.
The Electoral Commission today said they don't have the powers to investigate Mr. Banks' Isle of Man company, Rock Holdings, or his companies based in Gibraltar, all of which by law are banned from funding British election campaigns as they're offshore. And recently the question's also arisen as to whether the funds for Brexit really came from Russia. In his book, Banks reveals he had a 6-hour boozy lunch, his words, at the Russian embassy with the ambassador. And it's since emerged there were other meetings at which Banks was offered the chance to take part in lucrative deals involving gold mines and diamonds. Kathy Newman recently asked the Russian ambassador about it.
And he was one of the persons, whom we meet because, I was curious why he's giving so much money.
Then there's the Southern African connection. Earlier this year, Channel 4 News investigated several diamond mines in the region, which Mr. Banks had once said were one source of his wealth.
Diamond mines?
Diamond mines, yes, in Kimberley. We own 7 mines there, not all of them, but there's quite a cluster. And,
what's that worth?
Quite a lot.
But we found several mines shut, and evidence they'd been losing money and struggled to pay wages.
You understand that there's no people that come, there's no production there.
No production at all?
No production at all.
In court documents, Banks's former business partner in the mines claimed Banks had tried to plug the financial hole with Russian cash. But some of those funds, he alleged, were diverted to pay for Brexit.
The Leave campaign won the referendum.
Arron Banks has always denied such allegations, but when MPs tried to ask him about the source of his wealth earlier this summer, he ended up walking out.
I'm sorry, but there it is.
Mr. Banks, who's fishing in Bermuda right now, today issued this statement.
I am pleased that the Electoral Commission has referred me to the National Crime Agency. I am confident that a full and frank investigation will finally put an end to the ludicrous allegations levelled against me and my colleagues. There is no evidence of any wrongdoing from the companies I own. I am a UK taxpayer and I have never received any foreign donations. The Electoral Commission has produced no evidence to the contrary. The Electoral Commission has referred me to the National Crime Agency under intense political pressure from anti-Brexit supporters.
When I got hold of Arron Banks on the telephone this afternoon, he insisted that all the money he gave and lent to the Brexit campaigns was ultimately his money. The profits in large part, he says, of his insurance business, in which he has 500,000 motoring customers and a turnover of more than £250 million a year. And he complained that the allegations that the Electoral Commission was making had not been put directly to him before they sent them to the National Crime Agency. But the Electoral Commission replied to us tonight that they've had extensive correspondence with Mr Banks on these matters and his colleague Elizabeth Bilney. Their answers changed over time, the Commission told us, and company accounts and bank account records they allege were not consistent with what they said.
Michael Crick reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to Damien Collins MP, who chairs the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee. The panel recently summoned Arron Banks to give evidence for its inquiry into fake news and disinformation. I began by asking him whether he felt vindicated by today's announcement of a formal investigation.
Well, yes, the concern we expressed in our committee report in the summer, it would seem is shared by the Electoral Commission as well. We said that if it wasn't clear what the real source of the funds were that allowed Arron Banks to make these very large donations to Leave.eu, then it should be referred to the National Crime Agency to investigate. And the Electoral Commission have come to the same conclusion.
And these allegations, of course, you've looked into the truth behind these allegations. You yourself haven't been able to come up with any answers about where this money came from.
Well, no. When Arron Banks gave evidence to the committee, we weren't convinced by his answers that it was at all clear what the source of the money was. He seemed to have a series of businesses that didn't really seem to make any money. Businesses that had been sold by him, again, didn't seem to have brought much of a gain. So that's why we said it wasn't clear based on the evidence we'd received. And the NCA have got greater powers than we have as a parliamentary committee, and they should investigate if it wasn't clear. Right. And obviously the Electoral Commission share the same view.
What's clear in Arron Banks' mind is that he sees this all as a political campaign by people like you to derail Brexit.
Well, it's actually very simple. If he was able to demonstrate to the Electoral Commission what the real source of his funds were, then it wouldn't have been referred. And the Electoral Commission are not just referring it on the basis of doubts they have. They've been very specific that they don't believe that all the funds came from him. And they've named a business in the Isle of Man which they believe was one of the sources of these funds.
I mean, your committee has taken these allegations very seriously. Is one of the big problems for you that the government, that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, doesn't want to touch these allegations with a barge pole for political reasons?
Well, I think political reasons shouldn't stop the investigation of potential breaches of the law. The electoral law is important and it exists and it must be enforced. I think the government would probably say, though, that the correct enforcement here is not by ministers but by the relevant investigatory authorities. And I'm glad that at long last we now have the NCA looking at these issues.
But you can't divorce this from politics. I mean, Arron Banks thinks it is entirely politically motivated.
Well, I think he's doing that to offer up something of a smokescreen, to try and make out that he's some sort of a victim. But why should it be that if someone who's a highly connected political person may have committed electoral offences, why shouldn't they be investigated? Why is politics an excuse not to investigate somebody?
Let me ask you very bluntly, if it can be proven at the end of the day that there was foreign interference of one form or another in the referendum, should the result of that referendum be scrapped?
Well, I think there are two really important things here. Firstly, the investigations into individuals or campaigns that have done wrong, and if they have, they should face charges and prosecution for offences if they have committed them. The issue of whether that affects the outcome of the referendum as a whole is ultimately not a decision for the police or the National Crime Agency. That ultimately is a decision for the British people and for Parliament. And I don't think we could really speculate on that until we know whether these offences have been committed.
Damien Collins, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, still on politics, with so much resting on that Brexit vote 2 years ago, it was, of course, vital that all the campaigning was above board, free from any kind of foreign interference. But there's been some concern for a while that one of the pro-Brexit campaigns, fronted by Nigel Farage, may have been bankrolled with suspect loans. The political donor, Arron Banks, has been under investigation over where exactly the £8 million he gave to the Leave EU campaign actually came from. But today, the Electoral Commission formally handed over the investigation to the police in the form of the National Crime Agency. Mr Banks said he welcomed that and claimed the Commission had been lent on by anti-Brexit supporters.
Multi-millionaire Arron Banks presents himself as a cool customer. But today, Mr Banks, the biggest individual donor in British political history, is facing a criminal investigation into donations made during the Brexit referendum. Donations he and his colleague Andy Wigmore told me in June were not a police matter.
There have been calls for the police to look at all of this.
To investigate what? What's the crime? Yeah, what is the crime?
The Electoral Commission suspect it is illegal donations to Leave.eu, the referendum campaign Mr Banks funded and bankrolled. Arron Banks says he personally made £8 million worth of loans to Leave.eu. But the Electoral Commission suspects Mr Banks was not the true source of the money, that it came, possibly illegally, from an Isle of Man-based company he part owns, and that Mr Banks concealed the true details. According to MPs who've questioned Mr Banks, that raises serious issues.
The concern would be if this was a foreign donation that was made to a political campaign in this country, which would be an offence, and obviously people would want to know as well, if Arron Banks wasn't the ultimate source of this money, who was?
Arron Banks responded to all this today with a tweet declaring that he had gone fishing in Bermuda. He added, "I am confident that a full and frank investigation will finally put an end to the ludicrous allegations levelled against me and my colleagues. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing from the companies I own." Tonight, the man who fronted Arron Banks' Leave.eu campaign said the Electoral Commission were politically motivated.
I've had my battles with them. They tried really hard to close UKIP down as a political force, whilst at the same time ignoring big donations that went to the Liberal Democrats.
Arron Banks enjoys political sparring. He relished this ambush from a Remain campaigner with pork pies outside Parliament. But the National Crime Agency will be a more serious proposition. Leave.eu were not the main pro-Brexit campaign during the referendum, and even those who would desperately love to put a stop to Brexit concede that whatever else this investigation finds, it is unlikely to affect Britain's trajectory out of the European Union. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.